2022 is what most people would consider the 50th anniversary of the modern video game system. There may have been text-only and punch-hole games created before 1972, but that is the year that the first video game console, as we know them, was released. Since then, video game consoles and games have become more and more modern and more complex as the generations went on. To commemorate the 50th anniversary of the video game console, I'm going to count down the generations based on my hella subjective opinions and how much impact they had on me. Please remember that this countdown is subjective as hell and will probably be different than yours, but you're welcome to share your order in the comments below. So without further ado, here are the 9 video game generations ranked. My least favorite video game generation is also the first. Starting in 1972 and lasting until 1983, the first video game generation was underwhelming, to say the least. The only standout was the Magnavox Odyssey. At a time when 50 different companies were making the same Pong console, Magnavox released the Odyssey in 1972, making it the first home video game console. The Odyssey was an interesting beast, looking both modern and eclectic. It looked like it could have been produced today, but also produced in the 70s with its wood grain on the base of the console and on the controller. The Odyssey isn't all that far off from the classic Pong consoles, in that, on screen at least, all there is a few dots that players control. The big difference between the Odyssey and Pong consoles is that the Odyssey included overlays that go on your TV, turning the normal monochrome game into a haunted house game, a skiing game, and a tennis game. Nintendo even ended up getting into the Pong craze, as it released the Color TV Game 6, the company's first video game console. The Color TV 6 was released in November of 1977 for a price of 9,800 yen, or about 75 United States dollars. The console had 6 different games, all based around Pong. The distinction between them would be additional paddles or different sized paddles, as well as adding a deflective shield in the middle of the screen. Coming in 8th place is the current generation of consoles, released in 2020. The 9th video game generation, comprised of the Microsoft Xbox Series X and S and the PlayStation 5, has had a bumpy ride. Being released in the midst of a worldwide pandemic meant that a fraction of the consoles would be produced, compared to other generations.
There will be growth in esports specifically, but in the meantime, right now, esports has really taken it on the chin because, yes, physical events have gone away, just as they have everywhere else. And so a lot of the publishers involved in that have scrambled to move those sorts of events online.
It was incredibly hard for many people, including myself, to be able to get our hands on these consoles because they were so rare. Plus, there's the price gouging that was going on eBay and Facebook, where people could expect to pay upwards of double, if not more, the retail price for the console. Now don't get me wrong, the PS5 and the Series X and S are amazing consoles. They're the most powerful consoles to date, giving PC gaming a run for its money. But it is low on this list because of its original scarcity and the relative lack of great games. Believe it or not, this early in the countdown is where things get difficult. The rest of the generations are so good that, to rank them, almost seems wrong because they all deserve to be at the top. In 7th place, for me, is the 8th generation of systems, consisting of the Nintendo Wii U, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and the Switch. Now don't get me wrong, the Switch is an amazing console. It managed to dig Nintendo out of the hole they put themselves in with the Wii U. The Wii U is an interesting beast. I personally liked it. I thought the tablet controller was innovative, and they would end up molding that idea into the Switch. But the console was so similar to the original Wii that people were genuinely confused about what the Wii U was supposed to be. Was it an expensive add-on for the Wii? Was it a whole new console? Nintendo had a bit of trouble answering those questions. The Wii U did have some great games, including Super Mario Maker and the absolutely gorgeous Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. But it did also have its fair share of stinkers, including Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric and Hello Kitty Cruisers with a K. The PlayStation 4 and Xbox One fared a bit better, with each system bolstered by a bunch of great games. The Xbox One, interestingly enough, was the first Xbox console that was launched in China. People were optimistic about the Xbox One, but a few rumors going around before launch, including that the console would be, quote, always on, and requiring a Kinect sensor, made people proceed with caution. An employee of Microsoft Studios, Adam Orth, threw fuel on the flame by stating in a tweet, quote, "Sorry, I don't get the drama around having an always-on console. Every device now is always on. That's the world we live in. Hashtag deal with it." Another concern was that of digital rights management. Gamers were worried that they may not actually own the games they purchase, and certainly may not be able to resell those games. After announcing the console in 2013, Microsoft announced their plans for digital rights management, then backpedaled shortly after major backlash from consumers. It was finally revealed that the console would not always have to be on, and gamers would in fact own the games they purchase and can resell them as they wish.
Okay, Atari, let's see your best pitch.
Coming in at number 6 is the second generation of consoles that ran from approximately 1976 to 1992. This generation introduced gamers to one of the most iconic consoles ever, the Atari 2600. The 2600 was released in 1977 and popularized the use of microprocessors and ROM cartridges. Up until the release of the 2600, Atari had been known for popular arcade units, including classics such as Asteroids, Centipede, and Pong, but the company realized it would be cheaper to develop a home video game system. Early Atari 2600 games came on 2 kilobyte carts. That's kilobytes, not megabytes or gigabytes. 2 kilobytes. Amazing to think about some of the early games they produced on such a small amount of space. The downfall of Atari, and nearly the video game industry as a whole, came in 1982 when the 2600 essentially became a shovelware system. Anyone could create games for the system, and there was a ton of awful games released, including the infamous E.T. Then there was the Intellivision, made by Mattel and released in 1979. The Intellivision, along with Coleco's ColecoVision, were in direct competition with Atari. Intellivision had many innovations, including being the first console to include downloadable games. The Intellivision games Utopia and World Series Major League Baseball are considered to be the first construction sim and sports sim respectively, and it was the first console to feature real speech with the IntelliVoice voice synthesizer.
Mattel Electronics presents Tron. Seven, 5, 4, 5, 9.
Fifth place on this list goes to the third generation, also known as the 8-bit generation, that includes the NES, the Sega Master System, and the Atari 7800. Whoa, wait a minute. You're telling me that the NES generation isn't your favorite? You're insane, dude. Yep, I may be insane, but this generation is not the top to me. Yes, it single-handedly saved video games, and yes, it did have a ton of iconic games, but a good majority of them came from the NES alone. Now, show of hands, how many of you had an Atari 7800 or a Master System? 1, 2, 3. Not very many of you. But let's talk about the NES for a second. Nintendo looked to transition from making arcade games, similar to Atari, to compete in the home gaming market. The NES was a redesigned Famicom, and was released after the Famicom in the United States. There are some differences between the two, though. The Famicom was red and gray, was a top-loader, and looked like a spaceship. Its controllers were also hardwired into the system. However, Nintendo wanted to go for a more utilitarian design with the American NES. It's more rectangular shaped, it has more muted gray and white colors, and the NES featured a front-facing tray loader with a door to load games. The games themselves were also vastly different. The Famicom carts were colorful, with red carts, blue carts, yellow carts, and traditional gray carts. The NES, however, had one streamlined design, featuring larger gray carts. There were some games that had different colored carts, but those were mostly unlicensed games from smaller publishers. In fourth place is the fifth generation of game consoles, which consisted of the Sony PlayStation, Sega Saturn, Nintendo 64, and Atari Jaguar. This generation is notable because it's the first fully 3D generation. The generation also has some amazing systems and games. Sony and Nintendo were fighting for market share, and Atari was just happy to be there. Sega, on the other hand, released the Saturn, which was massive in Japan, but unfortunately didn't do so well in the West. It did garner a cult following with games such as Panzer Dragoon, Daytona USA, and Nights into Dreams. Then there's the Nintendo 64, which probably has the most impressive game lineup of any of the consoles in the 5th generation, including games like Super Mario 64, The Legend of Zelda: The Ocarina of Time, and GoldenEye 007. The Nintendo 64 was highly praised by reviewers prior to launch, and highly sought after by gamers, selling 350,000 units in the first 3 days after release, and 3.6 million units after its first year, far outpacing Sony and Sega. Then there's the PlayStation. Originally, Sony entered into a partnership with Nintendo to create a CD-ROM drive for the Super Nintendo. It was originally planned as an add-on for the Super Nintendo, as well as create a new hybrid system that would have been called the PlayStation. The partnership ended, unfortunately, but Sony continued development on the PlayStation, and it was finally released in September of 1995 in the United States. PS1 had a game library consisting of more than 3,000 titles, and features some of the most iconic games of all time, including Final Fantasy VII, the original Metal Gear Solid, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and Resident Evil 2. It also includes a ton of games that have stood the test of time and are still infinitely enjoyable today, including Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, Tomb Raider, and Gran Turismo. Coming in at third on my completely subjective list is the 7th generation of consoles, made up of the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Nintendo Wii. This was the second generation in a row that saw Microsoft, Nintendo, and Sony battle for gamers' dollars. This generation was also the first to feature the ability to connect the console to your TV via HDMI. It was also in the forefront of the newest video format wars between HD DVD and Blu-ray. When developing the PlayStation 3, Sony built in Blu-ray support to the console, making it the cheapest Blu-ray player at the time of its release, by quite a large margin. Meanwhile, Microsoft have put its support behind HD DVD, selling an external HD DVD drive for the 360. Then there was the Nintendo Wii.
We would like to play.
Arguably the most innovative console ever up to that point. The Wii used motion controls, which saw users stand and flail their arms around wildly to control players and objects on the screen. The Wii's success with motion controls prompted both Sony and Microsoft to implement motion controls into their consoles with PlayStation Move and Kinect, respectively. But those ideas fell flat rather quickly. For whatever reason, Nintendo was able to perfect motion controls. So now let's talk about the games. All 3 consoles had killer apps. Nintendo had absolutely gorgeous games including Super Mario Galaxy, The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess, and Super Smash Bros. Brawl. The PlayStation 3 countered with The Last of Us, Batman Arkham City, and the Uncharted series. And finally, the 360 featured Halo 3, the Gears of War series, and Forza Motorsport 3. Alright kids, we're down to the final 2. Get ready, because you might be surprised. Coming in at the runner-up position is the 4th generation of consoles, also known as the 16-bit generation, consisting of the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, and the TurboGrafx 16. Threw you off there, didn't I? Well, if you're a child of the 80s and 90s, you should vividly remember the war between Sega and Nintendo. I know I do. I remember how my family wasn't able to get either system, and I was always jealous when my friends would rent a Super Nintendo system from Blockbuster, as well as a couple games. They would always be psyched to be able to play video games all weekend. All I remember is that it cost like $50 to rent a system, and they had them in these cool overstuffed suitcases to protect them. It wasn't until my grandparents bought a Super Nintendo that I got mostly unfettered access to it. I was always mixed about staying at their house for a night. That is, until they got the Super Nintendo. Then I was over there all the time. Then there was a Sega Genesis. I was a huge Sonic fan. I had all 3 Sonic games, and I even had the Sonic and Knuckles DLC, whatever you'd like to call it. Anyways, my favorite game, however, was Sonic Spinball. I played the heck out of that when I was younger. I can still play the first couple levels almost blind today. Both companies were fighting for your dollars, and neither company held back any punches. What resulted is what many gamers of the era called the Bit Wars. Both the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis were 16-bit. What are bits anyways? Who knows? All we as kids knew was that it was something to brag and argue about on a regular basis. But enough about my petty childish squabbles. Let's talk about the games. I had to try really hard to only include a few games from both systems, mostly because the Genesis and Super Nintendo had one of, if not the, greatest game libraries ever. We'll start with the Super Nintendo. One of my favorite games was the Super Mario World Super Mario All-Stars Double Cart. I played the crap out of that, and I still have the cart to this day. The SNES version had better graphics than the NES originals. They were brighter, more vibrant. I remember I could play Super Mario Bros. 1 through 3 pretty well, being able to get pretty far in all those games. I know a lot of you will disagree with me, but my dark horse pick on that cart was the United States Mario 2. Yeah, it was just a reskinned version of Doki Doki Panic, but I liked it. It was different. It had different enemies and hazards. It had different power-ups and secrets. I loved it. The one game on the cart I liked, but could never get the hang of, was Super Mario World. It had so many tips and tricks to score points and skip levels, like the Yoshi Orb trick on Yoshi's Island 1. That stuff was beyond my comprehension. I just wanted to run around, stomp enemies, and collect coins, and that's what I did mostly. I also had immense trouble flying. I still have immense trouble flying in Super Mario World. But it was another game that was bright and colorful, had great music, innovative gameplay, and a pretty neat story. Another perennial game on the Super Nintendo was The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. Zelda games are so cool. You get to explore huge worlds, and you got a sword and bombs to use. A Link to the Past was the perfect blend of straightforward gameplay with complex battles and the ability to go mostly on your own path. It's also another one of the most beautiful games on the system. The graphics in A Link to the Past are so amazing. Everything is detailed, and you can tell they didn't half-ass the game at all. Combat is fluent, exploring is straightforward, and the music is awe-inspiring. The Genesis, however, had its share of amazing games, including Castlevania Bloodlines, which was made with the intention of pushing the Genesis power to its limits. Bloodlines goes back to basics and features some of the best combat since the original games on the NES. The game is beautiful and doesn't give you a chance to breathe. Mortal Kombat 2 is a follow-up to the, at the time, controversial Mortal Kombat. Blood, which is one of the game's signatures, is included this time, after not being included in the original. The game features 12 characters, including originals Liu Kang, Sub-Zero, and Raiden, as well as new characters such as Baraka, Jax, and Kitana. The graphics in the sequel are overhauled, and features that couldn't be included in the original are in the sequel. Fatalities are also back in the sequel, as well as new variations of them, including Babalities and Friendship.
Friendship.
And now, it's time for the top console generation, according to me. The best video game generation is the 6th generation, consisting of the original Xbox, PlayStation 2, GameCube, and Dreamcast. There were so many great games in this generation, where do I even start? There's the venerable Grand Theft Auto 3. GTA stayed under the radar for its first 2 releases, but all bets were off when the third was released in 2001. GTA 3 revolutionized not only video games as a whole, but also started one of the most popular genres ever, the sandbox game. Many other games would go on to try replicate the gameplay and world of Grand Theft Auto 3, but very few, if any, were successful. Nearly every game publisher from then on tried to catch some of GTA 3's magic, and often came up short. Liberty City was a metropolis that you could explore nearly every inch of, and it introduced the idea of not sticking to one central storyline. You could do virtually anything you wanted. Do you want to take a leisurely ride through Liberty City? You could do that. Did you want to tear through town, mowing down everyone in your way? You can do that as well. And the central missions would still be there for you when you're done. The graphics are amazing, the voice acting is top-notch, and you as the player have free reign to do anything you want. GTA 3 also included a bunch of radio stations to listen to, including Head Radio that includes pop, rock, and adult contemporary music, Double Clef FM, which features, of all genres, classical music, and my favorite station, Chatterbox FM, which takes calls from the citizens of Liberty City. Then there's Microsoft. Their Windows platforms have been a popular choice for games for decades, and in 2001, they entered the console market. They were up against stiff competition from Sony and Nintendo, and they knew they had to differentiate themselves from their competitors. In building the Xbox, Microsoft used standard, non-proprietary PC parts for the console, including a standard DVD drive and hard drive. The Xbox was, in some ways, technically superior to other consoles, including their use of the NVIDIA GeForce 3 NV2A GPU. The Xbox also had the future in mind, including a built-in Ethernet port and the creation of Xbox Live. Some say those factors kept the Xbox in the console race during the 6th generation. The Xbox would set sales records after release, having sold 1.5 million units after launch. The Xbox was also one of the first examples in gaming of a quote loss leader. The Xbox alone lost $4 billion over its life, but Microsoft would make up for that loss by offering AAA titles such as Halo 2, which allowed online multiplayer to explode with its co-op and capture the flag game modes. The Xbox would settle in second place behind the juggernaut that was the PlayStation 2. The Xbox far outsold the Nintendo GameCube and Sega Dreamcast, but was crushed by the popularity of the PS2. The GameCube was released at virtually the same time as the Xbox in November of 2001. The GameCube console was designed by ArtX, comprised of former members of Silicon Graphics, and the same group that designed the Nintendo 64. The system was formally announced in 1999, given the codename Dolphin, and was officially named the GameCube prior to its launch. The GameCube was a whole nother beast when it came to consoles in the 6th generation. While Microsoft and Sony went the safer route of offering a DVD drive, Nintendo included a mini optical drive, which could only play GameCube games, foregoing including DVD capabilities. The GameCube did offer online play, but it was not the main focus for the console, and you had to buy an extra broadband adapter to even get online. The GameCube did also offer an adapter that would allow you to play Game Boy Advance games, and had a proprietary disc for accessing Netflix, but that was about it for extras. Then there's the GameCube controller. Similar to the N64, the GameCube had a controller that was similar to other consoles, but was also very different. It included an analog stick and D-pad, but also included a second analog stick, as well as using a different button layout. Then Nintendo developed the Wavebird controller, which would be the first wireless controller developed by the maker of the console, and not just a third-party accessory. The Wavebird was lauded by fans and critics alike. The GameCube was released in September 2001 in Japan and November 2001 in the United States. Nintendo would sell 700,000 units in North America, putting it far behind the Xbox and PlayStation 2. So there you have it, the video game generations ranked. My choices may not be popular, but they're mine. Let me know down in the comments what your favorite generation is.